Morning,
Good
everybody.
morning.
Hey, Linz, how you doing?
Hello.
Good.
Morning.
Hi, everybody.
A very good morning, everybody. Thank you very, very much for joining us. My name is Siviwe Gwarube. I'm the DA's National Spokesperson and Deputy Chief Whip in Parliament. I'm joined this morning by DA Leader John Steenhuisen, and we're here to address you on our press conference regarding Cabinet performance agreements. As we head towards the motion of no confidence that has been scheduled by Parliament next week on the 30th of March, we thought it was quite important, following the call and the motion that was tabled by DA Leader on the 14th of February, to make an objective assessment around the performance of the Cabinet. You will recall that the President has routinely made commitments about signing performance agreements and making them public. He first made this promise back in 2019 about making sure that Cabinet signs these performance agreements and that they made public. He made again the commitment back in 2020, and the performance agreements were only then signed on October 2020. And we are made to believe that there's actually been no assessment that has been done based on these performance agreements, and that there has been actually no looking or at least reviewing some of the work that has been done. And that's why then the DA has taken the step to go through what has been publicly made available, which is all the performance agreements, looking at them thoroughly, but also making a quantitative assessment on what has been objectively met. So I do want to point this out. Some of you who have been and at some of our press conferences, this is not our ordinary Cabinet report card press conference. This is actually very much an objective assessment based on what has been made available by the Presidency and based on what we have been able to track. So these are targets or performance areas that were tracked, that are able to be tracked, and we have done that work. And so you will have in front of you addendums to the press conference, where you will be, to the press statement, where you will see what we've picked as some of the top 5 key performance areas of the departments, and we've made a finding based on what we've been able to ascertain. And you will also be able to see the kind of methodology that we use, which we've included there. So in some of the targets, we've said whether the targets have been met or partially met or not met at all. And we've looked at whether targets were over a year or over a 5-year period or 2024. So we're more than happy to take you through the methodology. But as I said, it was important to make an objective assessment to buttress our call for this Cabinet to be subjected to a motion of no confidence next week, as we tabled back in February this year. So John, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Siviwe, and thank you very much for those who are watching and those who are here today to participate. Next week on Wednesday, the 30th of March, Parliament's going to debate and then vote on the very first motion of no confidence tabled in Parliament in a Cabinet. This, as you may recall, I announced during the SONA, the State of the Nation address, which was debated on the 14th of February. I was going to say this is not an action that we've taken lightly, because removing an entire Cabinet is a highly disruptive intervention. But we really do believe that, given the state of destruction being wrought in our economy by the incompetence, the indifference and the corruption of ministers, we really have no other choice. And we must use the mechanism that the Constitution has provided us with to be able to do so. It's also become very, very clear to us that, despite his assurances, President Ramaphosa has neither the will nor the clout to hold a single one of his ministers accountable for his or her performance. The point we've made is that if he is not prepared to do it, then we will do it. because the lives of ordinary South Africans now literally do depend on it. You may have noticed last week in President's Questions that we've dubbed this cabinet the Poverty Cabinet, because as a direct result of their disastrous policies, incompetence, an epidemic of poverty, unemployment and inequality has been leashed upon our society. Their actions as ministers, or inactions in many instances, have caused the despair and the suffering of millions. And all the metrics that measure the suffering are moving in absolutely the wrong direction. And South Africa is now a global outlier in this regard. And so the problems must lie with us here in South Africa, or more specifically, with our government. Now, while all South Africans instinctively know that the situation here is deteriorating, our decision to table a motion of no confidence in Cabinet was not based on feelings or perception. There is a wealth of objective, quantifiable evidence to show that every minister in this Poverty Cabinet has failed to do their job and has contributed to the demise of our economy and the suffering of ordinary South Africans. And at the very heart of this evidence lies the set of performance agreements signed by ministers in October 2020. Under pressure from a lack of accountability in his government, President Ramaphosa announced almost 3 years ago, at the start of South Africa's 6th Parliament, that he would rectify this by introducing performance agreements for every member of his cabinet. He then said that he would help this would help him to monitor, track progress against specific targets, and at the time he spoke of what he called regular evaluations and taking action against errant ministers. And I quote from him directly: "I will be signing performance agreements with each and every one of the ministers and deputy ministers, which will be evaluated regularly against clearly stated targets and clearly stated performance outcomes. And where implementation is unsatisfactory, action will be taken." Unquote. That was on the 19th of May 2019. 9 months later, by the following year's SONA in February 2020, there was still no sign of these performance agreements. But again, he assured the country that this would happen, and this time he added a deadline, that by the end of the month. But that deadline, like so many of his SONA promises, came and went. And it was only in October of 2020 that ministers finally signed those performance agreements, to much fanfare. 17 months later, nothing further has really happened. No minister has been made to answer for his or her progress, and there's no sign whatsoever of the so-called regular evaluations that were meant to be taking place. We're now past halfway through the term of this administration, and it's become abundantly clear that these performance agreements were nothing but a box-ticking exercise to create the illusion of accountability. In fact, in most cases, the targets in these supposed 4-year performance plans were just copied and pasted from the minister's 2019 annual performance plans for their departments, meaning they're likely to become redundant before 2024 anyway. The reality is there's never been any real intention to use these performance agreements as a real tool of accountability. After the initial media coverage and the fanfare of the president signing these agreements with ministers, they've simply been left to gather dust. Luckily, though, the agreements are publicly available. And so we in the DA, and in our role as the official opposition, took it upon ourselves to evaluate each of the 28 cabinet ministers against their own targets. We deliberately excluded the qualitative targets in these agreements, such as institutional oversight and political leadership, partly because these seem to be very generic and are absolutely non-specific, and also because evaluating performance against these targets would be seen as subjective. We wanted to score the ministers accurately, fairly, and objectively by removing any possible bias that we could have, which is why we focused solely on the quantitative targets. And we were also very generous when it came to targets that haven't been achieved yet, but for which ministers were still on track. For the sake of this scorecard, we considered these targets as met. In total, for all 28 ministers across 27 departments, we identified 757 of these interventions or targets. And of these 757 targets, only 241 of them have actually been achieved. That's a score, if you do the maths, of just 32%. While this included a range of scores that spanned almost 50 percentage points, only 3 ministers achieved 50% or more of their targets. the highest being 56%. 4 more scored in the 40s, and the rest were spread across the 30s, 20s, and teens. The lowest score was a paltry 8% of the targets achieved. Some of the worst performing ministers, Siv, you want to take us through that?
Yeah, some of the worst performing ministers, Minister Mamboloko Kubayi, Human Settlements, alongside with Minister Senzo Mchunu. And we combined these two because, of course, Minister Kubayi is still quite new in this department, and so you got the 8%. Minister Fikile Mbalula of Transport, 16% of the targets achieved. Minister Njabeni, again, also quite new at Communications and Digital Technologies, with 19% of the targets achieved. Minister Mondli Ngugubele in the presidency, 19% of the targets achieved. Minister Ngowane Mashabane, 21% of the targets achieved. Minister Thulas Nxesi, 24%. Minister Gwede Mantashe, 24% of his targets were achieved. Minister Patricia de Lille, 24% of the targets were achieved. And Minister Lindiwe Sisulu of Tourism, 24% of these targets were achieved.
Even the highest score achieved, which was ironically by Minister of Police Bheki Cele of all people, poses more questions than answers and forced us to drill down into these performance contracts a little bit more deeply. And some of these so-called targets involved just submitting a report, or where an intervention was just something like increased visible policing. It could have been a quantifiable target, including things like boots on the ground, but the performance agreement makes absolutely no mention of any of these targets and has rendered them meaningless, as you can see by the latest crime statistics report that comes out, the latest report on gender-based violence, the latest report on murders and robberies. It's very clear that it shows the folly of having targets that are not quantifiable, because you can get a 56%, but South Africans feel afraid and in fear on their homes, their businesses, and on the streets of South Africa. Equally baffling is the fact that the Public Enterprise Minister, Pravin Gordhan's performance agreement, makes no mention whatsoever of eradicating corruption at our state-owned entities, or the crucial metrics of irregular, wasteful, and fruitless expenditure. And these are the biggest crises facing our state-owned entities. The minister's very, very short performance agreement gives him an absolute free ride on this critical part of his job. Deputy President David Mabuza, South Africa's greatest export to the Russian Federation, doesn't even have a performance agreement. And if he does, it's certainly not publicly available. So it's unclear how his performance is actually judged. He seems to be shielded completely from all accountability. Now, the fact is that these performance agreements paint a picture of a cabinet that has failed in every single aspect of its duty. Not one of these ministers would have passed a performance assessment in the private sector, which raises a question. What does President Ramaphosa consider an acceptable score? In his recent reply to SONA, he expressed his complete satisfaction with his entire cabinet, saying, and I quote, "I preside over a cabinet of ministers committed to their responsibilities, ministers in whom I have the greatest confidence as president, and more importantly, in whom the people of the country also have the confidence and the highest expectations," unquote. In other words, the president has said to the people of South Africa that he considers a cabinet that achieves on average less than a third of its targets is good enough for them. Well, we couldn't disagree more. We think South Africans deserve better than that, which is why we are going to do everything we can and use every mechanism we can available to us to fire this poverty cabinet and give South Africa a fresh start, to throw off this yoke of incompetence, indifference, and inability to do the work, and corruption that we're shackled with as the people of South Africa, and which is responsible for large amounts of the poverty, suffering that so many of our citizens go through on a daily basis. To further strengthen oversight, the DA is going to use the mechanisms available here in Parliament. First of all, we're going to submit a proposal to the Rules Committee to once again call for the establishment of a portfolio committee on Vote 1, the presidency. That is the only budget vote in the entire budget that doesn't have an oversight committee. And given that the president has now centralized so many of the functions of state and co-opted so much of what his ministers should be doing into the presidency, we believe it's absolutely now essential that such a oversight committee is created by Parliament so that Parliament can hold that department accountable. Furthermore, every one of the shadow ministers is going to be writing to their particular committee chairperson of the portfolio committees in Parliament, who the Constitution enjoins with the responsibility of executive oversight, to request that these performance agreements are tabled at that committee and that the minister is summoned to account for their performance or otherwise in terms of this particular performance agreement. We're not going to fix what's wrong with South Africa or beat poverty with a poverty cabinet. We're also not going to solve the many problems that have been exposed in the Zondo Commission report, in the report of into the July riots, into the many of the other reports that have come out about inequality in South Africa, with this current bunch of ministers sitting around the same table, making the same decisions that have got us into the trouble in the first place. We need to change, and accountability is going to have to be the core of that change. Without it, we're going to just muddle along with more of the same. We're going to see more and more of our citizens pushed into the unemployment queues, and we're going to see many more of our citizens suffering as this winter of discontent starts to chill across South Africa in the coming weeks and months. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John. And so, colleagues, with that, the main three announcements that we're making today, of course, is that this was important for us as a precursor to the motion of no confidence that is taking place next week in Parliament, and also that we will be making a submission to the Rules Committee in particular to have a portfolio committee that deals with the presidency. It's something that has been driven by the DA for many years, and that these performance agreements must be the subject of discussion in the various committees that pertain to the ministers. And so now I'm going to open the floor to questions. If you can then indicate your name and your publication, and then we'll take it from there. Lindsay.
Lindsay Dating at UNCA. There were some indications given in the program committee, I think it was last week, that the DA might also challenge the Speaker's decision not to have a secret ballot on your motion of no confidence, as well as the other one that will be heard on or be debated on the same day. Do I take it now that the DA is not going to pursue that for a secret ballot?
Shall we just take three and then you can respond,
cool.
okay?
Yeah.
Babalo, and then Ati.
Hi, can I, oh, sorry.
Hello there, CR.
Okay, I'm Babalo from Eyewitness News. Should the motion not succeed, then what then?
Sure.
And should the motion succeed, hypothetically speaking, what then? What then do you do as the DA, since there will be no cabinet? And, what would you suggest the process be? And on the presidency portfolio committee, is Mondli Gungubele or whoever the minister in the presidency is, them accounting, to portfolio committee of whether it's public enterprises or the portfolio committee on public service and administration, wherever is required, is that not enough? And will that perhaps not be an argument put forward by the ANC? I suspect they have made that argument, that the presidency does account, to Parliament, to a portfolio committee level. Thank you.
Ati.
Ati Mtamala from Newsroom Africa. Thank you for this opportunity. I just wanted to get clarity on that motion against the President's cabinet. Are they going to participate in the debate and the vote? How do you envision that process to unfold? Thank you.
Cool. John, if you can handle Lindsay and Ati.
Yeah, thanks very much. Lindsay, you ask a very good question. Well, first of all, I don't think that the secret ballot here is necessarily the turning point for our motion. The president is elected by a secret ballot, and I think that there is a case to be made that he should be deselected by a secret ballot, but that's not our fight. Our motion of no confidence is not in the president, because, as I've said on public record before, what's waiting in the wings there in the ANC is too ghastly to contemplate. So our focus was on the cabinet excluding the president. Our bigger concerns are, and to deal with RT's question, which I think is the right one, is simply this. The parliamentary rules are very, very clear, as well as the Code of Ethical Conduct, about conflicts of interest and whether people are allowed to participate in a vote if they have a conflict of interest. I would advance the fact that a house in Pretoria, a house in Cape Town, a vehicle in Pretoria, a vehicle in Cape Town, the perks and benefits of being a minister, as well as the multi-million rand salary, is a clear and present conflict of interest. And should the cabinet be allowed to vote? And we have addressed correspondence to the Speaker from our attorneys in this regard. The second thing that I think is absolutely essential is that Parliament must now convene in person for this debate to take place. I don't think that members of Parliament who are recognised in both the rules as well as the Guide to Procedure as individual members of Parliament are going to be serviced in this debate by a chief whip standing up and say, well, we have so many members and they vote this way. I think that every South African should know how their members of Parliament voted on this particular matter, so that when they are living in poverty and unemployment and misery, they can know exactly who to pin this particular problem on, and it'll be the MPs that support those ministers. So for me, in this particular instance, a secret ballot is less of an issue. The fact that MPs should be allowed to vote with their conscience and not simply have a chief whip standing up and saying, well, I represent 240 MPs and therefore I'm casting their vote in a certain way. I think that's wrong. I think it's against the spirit of the Constitution, which provided this mechanism for Parliament and MPs particularly to hold the Cabinet accountable. And I also frankly think, as we've said before, that it's time for Parliament to get back to work. We can't expect the rest of the country to get back to work, and we're sitting still with this virtual meeting in what looks like a district council meeting taking place. That's not Parliament. Parliament is all of the members of Parliament coming together to achieve the objectives of the Constitution, holding the executive accountable, a forum for national public debate, passing laws and making sure we elect or deselect, in this case, office bearers. And I think that that's absolutely essential. Babalo, well, look, we would love the motion to succeed. And I think it would send a very strong message out that there is accountability in South Africa. I also happen to know from a number of sources in the parliamentary corridors that there's an appetite from this amongst certain factions in various parties. We also believe that we have had a discussion about this motion in the multi-party meeting that was convened a little while ago, and I think that we will have support from a majority of the opposition parties, because they too understand how much suffering and misery they're causing. If it does not succeed, well, we will continue to do what we do as the official opposition, to hold those ministers accountable. And that's why we've got these backup action steps now in terms of tabling the performance agreements in committees, and of making sure that there are committees established to do the whole issue around holding these ministers accountable. I really do, however, believe that South Africans need to unite behind this motion. It shouldn't just be seen as a DA motion. It should be seen as a motion that's acting in their best interests. To have a Minister of SASSA that's water cannons the various recipients that she should be looking after, to have a Minister of Tourism that's too busy fighting an independent judiciary to attract tourists to the country, to have a police minister who gets completely eviscerated in an independent report and carries on as if nothing has happened. To have ministers that are themselves implicated now in the Zondo Commission findings. It's not a tenable situation. And if at the very least this comes as a wake-up call to President Ramaphosa that this poverty cabinet is never going to achieve what he would like to see happening for South Africa, I think then it's achieved its goal. But I do think that South Africans need to understand that there are mechanisms that have been provided to us as citizens and as parliamentarians to hold the executive accountable, and one of those is a motion of this type. In terms of the accountability, I don't think it's good enough. I don't think it's good enough for the presidency to be setting an example of accountability, and every other vote in the budget reports into a portfolio committee, but his does not. And I don't think it's good enough for Mr. Gungubele to float around like a butterfly to various committees. I think there does need to be a central place where the presidency can be pinned down on a variety of the things that they should be doing, and that the president should be summoned to appear before those committees. And this isn't new in South Africa. If you go to, I would advance, the majority of the provincial legislatures, there is a Premier's Portfolio Committee. I know when I served in KwaZulu-Natal, I was able to hold the then Premier, Zweli Mkhize, to account in those committees, and he would appear before them, and we would be able to interrogate his budget, interrogate his plans. That is wholly absent in the parliamentary environment. I can't recall whether the president's ever been called before a parliamentary portfolio committee to account. And this stands in sharp juxtaposition to other democratic parliaments around the world, where former Prime Ministers Blair, Cameron, Johnson, others are regularly summoned before parliamentary committees to account for their actions. And I think there is a huge missing step in South Africa where we allow the presidency to just simply float above the accountability model. And that's why I think it's absolutely essential that that presidency is rooted in a committee, and we're able to hold the president and his minister in the presidency accountable as well. Artie, I think I've answered your question. I think there is a clear and present conflict of interest. And at the very least, I would expect those ministers at the beginning of the debate to be compelled to at least stand up and declare that they have a conflict of interest in their head, and for the Speaker then to make a ruling on how it proceeds. We hope, however, that this matter is resolved before we move to the vote next week. I can't speak for what the ATM are going to do around litigation, but obviously if the Speaker proceeds with a stubbornness to accept the fact that every single procedure in Parliament recognises individual members of Parliament, and I think them being able to express themselves on this particular matter, then I think it's letting Parliament down, and it's once again taking Parliament down the road that the Nkandla Committee findings, the Constitutional Court findings, and the Zondo Commission findings are now saying of a Parliament that is toothless and unable to do its job.
And I just think, and added to that, Babalo, I think that there's definitely, in my view, very much a culture in Parliament, particularly from the governing party, that the president must just come once a term and simply come and answer questions. The reality is that there are different accounting mechanisms in Parliament, and we must use them. And there's often a culture, and I see it definitely in the NAPC, in the other forums that I sit in, where there is very much a dumbing down of the accountability mechanisms that are available in Parliament. And therefore, that portfolio committee must sit, because portfolio committees are the engine rooms of the work of Parliament. Simply having a 3-hour session with the president to ask him questions that were sent to him prior once a term is not good enough to interrogate issues like performance agreements, to interrogate the budget vote which is allocated to the presidency. And so I think based on that, it's entirely important. And so those are the arguments that we'll be making to the Rules Committee on that basis.
I also think it's important because South Africa is about to enter some very, very tough waters. As I said, we've already seen the rising food prices, the fuel prices. There's a global inflation increase wave that's going to hit us. Just yesterday, other global economies announced that they're heading towards inflation rates of what they experienced in the 1950s. And we need a cabinet and a government that's going to be able to steer us through this really tough winter that lies ahead. And if we don't, and if people feel that they've got a cabinet and a government that doesn't hear them or is indifferent completely to their causes and their concerns and their dreams and their aspirations, that we're going to see the use of extra parliamentary means to make their voices heard. And we saw that in July last year, and we saw how quickly that can happen, and we saw how quickly it can spread. And on the back of rising fuel prices, rising food prices, poverty, the fact that grants increases are going to be completely outstripped by rising inflation and prices of electricity, I really think that this is going to be a very tough time, and it's going to require bold leadership to steer South Africa through that. And I think we're already seeing some of that fraying of the fabric expressing itself around South Africa in the xenophobia we see. We've got to do better in South Africa. We can't just continue trying to do the same thing with the same people around the same table, making those decisions that got us into this place in the first place.
I'm going to take one last round of questions and then we'll take it from there. Yes, sir. Sorry, I did miss you the last round.
Okay, Joseph Musia from SABC. How can the DA sit there and say this is an objective assessment when the DA is a political party that is trying to get the current government out of government? And how do we believe that any of your actions against the government is objective? Because actually it can't be, because you want the government out. That your motion is to gain an advantage over the current government. Why do you call your assessment objective? And secondly, it would be interesting, because unfortunately I don't have the information in front of me, what you would give the ministers like the Minister of Health and in terms of the scores, and the Minister of, say for instance, the Environment, and what you would give the Minister of SES, what is it called? State Security. And why would the Minister of State Security get anything higher than Senzo Mtuli?
Cool. Thank you, Joseph. Lindsay, Babalo, any other takers? All right, cool. That will, yes,
Just
Lindsay.
following on from Joseph about the actual performance agreements. So,
Okay.
I mean, we don't know how exactly you carried out the assessment, but seeing as we're halfway through the term of the current executive, so at what point do you then say, well, they haven't made these targets, when essentially I would presume they've got 5 years to make that target. So what deadlines, how are you determining what deadlines you were putting to them? And if you say these performance agreements are so poorly composed that they are cut and paste, whatever, why did you not take issue back in 2020 when you saw what these performance agreements, what the measurables or what the targets were?
Cool. Babalo?
Just to follow up on the motion.
Okay.
Is the ATM's earlier motion the reason why you did not take the motion against the president? Or is this a vote of confidence in the president? We like your tone and posture, but we just don't like your cabinet. So did the ATM do you an administrative favor by tabling their motion before yours, or you don't mind the president?
Okay.
Great.
Cool.
Thanks very much, Joseph, for those. Well, we would, as I said, we removed all of the subjective things where it would be subject to a political assessment on something, and focused on the quantitative targets in each instance, where the ministers have been given specific targets to reach, whether it's very clear from evidence that they have not reached those. They're publicly available, and so we're providing a full copy of the methodology in this document and our basis of our assessments in this document, but whether there was an achieved, partially achieved or not achieved. So we've acknowledged where ministers have achieved against target, and I think it is the most objective assessment that's been done, and I think that we absolutely need to make sure that the objective of these was to measure ministers' performances. As I said, we're now halfway through the term of this administration, and I'm yet to see the outcome of any interventions or any announcement by the president that he's assessed these ministers, done this assessment. Where's his document like this? He should be making a document like this available on an annual basis to the people of South Africa, saying, well, our Minister of Police got a red, and we got 32%, therefore I'm taking the following steps to rectify it. I've given him the following objectives to achieve. That's what real accountability exists. This was nothing more than a publicity stunt, very, very clearly at the time, which we said at the time, that this is a publicity stunt if they are not measuring what matters. And I've used the example of the SAPs there, where they haven't measured what matters. But these are the president's performance agreements. They're not Parliament's performance agreements. It's an agreement that they've signed with the president. Our job as Parliament is to assess these and to see whether, in fact, ministers have been held accountable towards those performance agreements. I would like to say that we did our very best to remove as much subjectivity out of it. And of course, we're a political party in a political environment, but I think that it is a genuine hand-on-heart effort at getting to an objective outcome there. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, can I make an example? So, Joseph, I mean, you will have this. You will have this this document with you. So, for instance, you ask about the Minister of Health as an example, right? So, one of the targets that are in the performance agreement is the costing and finalization of the human resource and health strategy plan. The due date for that was October 2020. It has not been done. So when we talk about objective, measurable outputs, we're talking about, it was not, whether it's a subjective view on whether or not the pandemic was handled. Again, the fact that assessments have not been done, it means that every year these performance agreements are not being changed and amended to fit the context of the country. So these are some of the things, as Lindsay says, that are 5-year plans. And so because there was a due date there, Lindsay, for instance, it's easy to be able to say it has not been achieved. In instances where the period in question is over 5 years and there has been some progress, we have indicated either it's partially achieved or we have indicated that it has been achieved. And so there's some tangible ones that you can go through, and as I said, we will be able to make these available, and you will be able to, for yourself, look at what the performance agreement says, look at some of the quantifiable things that we've been able to look at, and where there's deadlines and they have not been met, or whether there was a strategy that was meant to be published that wasn't, or facilities that were meant to be built that have not been built, we've indicated that it has not been achieved. And that's what we mean, I suppose, by the objectivity, not because we're an objective player here, but the way in which the assessment has been done is not on our view of the cabinet, but on what they were agreed to and what they signed to do and have not done. Yeah.
Babalo, thanks very much for your question. The motion that the ATM moved was done, I think it's almost over a year ago, if I remember correctly. 2 years. It's almost 2 years. So this was not influenced by that at all. And I was very, very clear in the State of the Nation response to the President that we agreed with some of the interventions that he would like to make in the country. Our point, however, was that he is never going to achieve any of those objectives with this cabinet sitting around the table. And that if he's not going to take action against the cabinet, then he has passed his own motion of no confidence in his cabinet. And that's evidenced by the fact that he is now absorbing many of their responsibilities from environment, small business, state security, into the presidency to be able to get things done there, because he knows that whatever goes to cabinet will just simply hit that brick wall and fail, whether it's been the NDP, whether it's been any one of these great government programs that's been announced. It runs straight into that dead wall of a cabinet that does not want to implement these things, or can't implement these things, or has no capacity to do so. I also have been very, very clear that when you're in politics, you've got to think about strategy and tactics. So tactically, we could put a motion of no confidence in the president. Given the divisions in the ANC, what do we do if it succeeds? Do we end up with David Mabuza as the new president? Do we end up as Lindiwe Sisulu as the new president? So I think the big question in politics that you have to make if you're thinking strategically is compared to what? So I certainly don't have confidence in the president that he's going to get the country moving forward, and which is why we will contest him into the 2024 election for the governance and power of this country so that we can turn things around. If I had confidence in him, I would be a member of the ANC. I'm a member of the DA. I'm a member of the official opposition and the leader of the opposition. And so I don't have confidence in him by fulfilling this particular role. But what I'm not going to do is open the door for the internal factional battles of the ANC, which have now been identified as the biggest risk to South Africa's stability, playing out in our country, because I think that the spectre of a Sisulu presidency or a Mabuza presidency, as I said earlier, is frankly too ghastly to contemplate. And I think the president should be given a chance to implement some of these things that he said in his SONA, which, as I said at the time, came straight out of the DA playbook. And we've been clear right from the beginning of my term of office that rather than being petty and nitpicking, when the president announces good things, we will support them and we will get behind him and use our seats in Parliament to help him drive those reforms. But we will stand up vigorously against him where we disagree with him, and we showed that very clearly with the expropriation without compensation. We're going to show it on NHI. But where the president focuses on cleaning up and cleaning out and driving the right reforms, we will support those, and I think that's what a responsible political party would do. But the fact that we haven't put a motion of no confidence in the president doesn't mean that we have confidence in him. But I think that in this particular stage in South Africa, we have a cabinet that has failed the people. It's failing to do what it needs to do, and it needs to be removed. And the sooner it happens, frankly, the better.
Right, I think that covers all our questions. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you for coming through. We apologize for the lack of air conditioning in this room, but thank you very much.